Okay, guys, this is the end of chapter 13. We're going to do a little bit of reflecting. Ooh, I thought I had a highlighter there. A little bit of reflecting and focusing on the centrality of context in world history. We have talked a lot about context, especially as we've covered the CCOT essay and the necessary explanation of context to explain the process of change or the process of a continuity. And so let's talk a little bit more about context in world history and the centrality of that. World history establishes broader context within which selected facts and cases take on a whole new meaning. World history considers many different topics that require us to put diverse areas of the world into a proper context to explain all of those different things that create these new meanings. European colonization of the Americas takes on different meanings when it's compared to the other empire-building projects. This helps to counter that Eurocentrism, right, and the focus of Europe being at the center of world history, and allows us to see more clearly the distinctive features of the European empires. Contextual thinking allows us to compare the European empires in the Americas with the Ottomans and the Asian empires in terms of violence and impact upon those conquered peoples, and that really puts things into perspective. Okay. Now let's get to the visual sources. Okay, so this first one here, you look at this, disaster foretold. Why might Aztec contributors to the codices that have included accounts of such supernatural events preceding the arrival of the Spanish? Well, such a momentous event as the collapse of the Aztec Empire seemed to require such portents, right? And in retrospect, the appearance of a comet before the arrival of the Spanish seemed to have a meaning, right? Arrival of that comet. And the Spanish may have encouraged such an interpretation because they sought to legitimize their rule and their conquest and the conversion of the local population, right? And the Aztecs were so heavily influenced by their spirituality. So why do you think the Spanish frequently incorporated such accounts into their own description of the conquest of the Aztecs? Well, for the Spanish, heavenly portents legitimized their conquest and the role of the region. The Spanish may have seen them as a sign from the Christian God sanctioning their conquest and missionary efforts, or may have used them to help convince the indigenous peoples that the Spanish conquest and rule was sanctioned by divine authorities. And so that's an interesting image in this painting on what something like this could actually mean. Something to think about is why might the artist have chosen to show Montezuma here alone rather than in the company of his supposedly fearful people? Well, showing Montezuma alone may recount a specific event in the codex, or it may have been chosen for artistic or aesthetic reasons, because more figures could have cluttered the scene and distracted the viewer from the comet, which is believed to be the focus of this picture. And it may emphasize Montezuma's role as interpreter of the signs for his people. Okay. Visual source 2, Montezuma and Cortez. Right, you can see Cortez here, and Montezuma, and of course, Doña Maria, right? So how does this painting present the relationship between Cortez and Montezuma? Are they meeting as equals, enemies, allies, ruler, subject? That's an interesting thought for this picture. Notice that both are sitting in a European-style chair. which had come to suggest authority in the decades following the Spanish conquest, right? You could argue that because they are seated in similar chairs and in similar postures, the rulers might have been seen as equals, although Cortez seems to be on what looks like maybe a platform. And that could indicate a superior status in this exchange. And Montezuma is attended by his courtiers, which may indicate his higher status. But, it could also make the case that Cortez acts as the ruler in this picture because he is seated on that platform and may have received tribute from Montezuma. And that's what could be depicted in the foreground, right? But maybe Montezuma is the ruler in this image because he's dressed in high status clothing. He's attended by those courtiers. He's seated in a chair. You might reasonably interpret the tribute in the foreground as one given by Cortez to Montezuma. So what do the items at the bottom of the image represent? Right? Tribute, gifts, each of these here, right? And does this image support or challenge the perception that the Aztecs viewed the Spanish newcomers, at least essentially in religious terms, as gods? There is little in this picture that indicates the Aztecs viewed the Spanish as gods. The Aztec figures in the image do not show that kind of reverence. The gifts at the bottom of the picture might merely be offers of hospitality as opposed to tribute. But the Aztecs you could argue that they did view the Aztecs as Spanish, or the Aztecs viewed the Spanish as gods, pointing out the replacement of Cortez on a platform, the offering of gifts or tribute, and that might even be part of a worship of Cortez. So think about what the painter might have tried to convey by placing three attendants behind Montezuma while Cortez appears alone, except for his translator. Well, the attendants over here indicate that the meeting took place at Montezuma's court and that Cortez is the visitor, maybe. Or another interpretation is that Montezuma held the status of a king at this meeting while Cortez is held in a lesser status. Well, that's possible. So, what impression of Doña Marina does this image suggest? Well, Doña Marina's dress, posture, even her facial expression indicate that she is a full participant in the conversation, fulfilling the critical role of translator, which is actually unusual for a woman in a patriarchal society. There's some very interesting things going on in this painting. Okay, and our third visual source, the Massacre of the Nobles. This is a intense image here. What elements of the description above are reflected in this painting? Okay, well, the Spaniards control the entrances and the passages. The sacred patio is depicted. Right, the victims are being speared. Specific wounds like beheading are depicted, as well as the flowing of blood. Here's a beheading. There. See. Random limbs. Here's another beheading. And the drums are shown, and the drummer is depicted both beheaded and with amputated arms. That's also interesting. So what image of the Spanish does this painting reflect? Well, it definitely shows the brutality of the Spanish and their willingness to use violence against unarmed opponents. What do the drums in the center of the image represent? I think that's a very interesting question. Well, I think this is probably a ceremony, and the drums here represent the disrupted ceremony and the holy inner sanctum of that ceremonial site. when the Spanish have come in to conquer, you know, seeing as brutal and violent as this is, and their control of the passageways and the entrances, right? Oh, man. That puts a whole other perspective on it, doesn't it? Which is the point of these visual images. Okay, the Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan. So whose perspective do you think is represented in this one? That of the Spanish, their Tlaxcala allies, or the Aztecs? That was a tribe. It was an enemy of the Aztecs. How might each of them have understood this retreat differently? The Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan. You know, you could argue for, you know, the Spanish perspective because of the focus on the causeway withdrawal, right, out to Tenochtitlan, and the prominence of the Spaniard on horseback. You could argue for the Tlaxcala perspective because of who drew the images, right, and the prominence of their warriors. You could argue for an Aztec perspective because it recounts their triumph, and through the warriors in canoes, and accurately depicts their successful tactics. And the Spaniards may have seen the retreat as a relatively successful tactical withdrawal from a difficult position, or as a defeat. Or you could even say that the Tlaxcala likely viewed it as a defeat, with the potentially significant repercussions depending on whether their Spanish allies withdrew permanently. Right? But the Aztecs likely viewed the battle as a triumph, based on this picture, that expelled foreign invaders from their capital. So it's interesting to think about the perspective from this painting. And here's the interesting question, or thing to think about. Neither in this source or this visual source are the Spanish portrayed with their firearms. Did anybody pick up on that? So how would you understand the omission of the firearms by the Spaniards? Well, that's it, right? The perspective and who the artist is. Well, these visual sources were drawn by indigenous artists, and their depictions of battle emphasize the traditional close quarters combat as opposed to the long distance or longer distance with the firearm. And perhaps those indigenous artists didn't recognize the importance of firearms for the Spanish military superiority, or at least not initially. Maybe the firearms weren't actually used in this retreat. But what's interesting is the blending of artistic styles in this image, as well as the omission of the firearms. The water, the boats, the shields, those are all shown in traditional Mesoamerican fashion, while the Spanish are portrayed in European stereotypes. Right? What does that blending suggest about the cultural processes at work in the codices? Well, indigenous artists adopted new styles to depict those new subjects, but maintained older traditions when they depicted familiar subjects, and the process was syncretic, right? With the artists adopting what they found useful from European artistic traditions, but also kept what they'd wanted from their own traditions. So how does the Aztec created image from your book represent the impact of the disease? Do you remember? I can't remember what page that's on, but it's in the chapter, and it's an Aztec created image about the impact of the diseases. Well, it represents, think about it, the widespread impact of the epidemic, right, and their efforts to treat those who succumbed, and the weakened state of the population, how weak they became because of what they had lost. Just some interesting things to think about. Remember, your Part 4 test will be over documents and visual sources. See See you guys for chapter 14.